Hey folks, back again. Another review of sorts for Vows of Iron, rules for recreating medieval battles in miniature. And that's exactly what it attempts to do, which is recreate battles of the Middle Ages, really, as well as the Crusades. So this is a set of rules that's very focused, both on European and the Crusades. You've got everything from the Barons' Revolt up to the War of the Roses, the 100 Years' War, all that goodness is in here. That's what these rules are focused on. And of course, this really garnered my attention because it does narrow the focus down on a particular period of history. As many of you know, the ancients' rules, as they're called, usually cover 3,000, 4,000 years of history. And you've got everything from Romans and Greeks and Egyptians, all the way up to knights, the War of the Roses, and that's a lot of time to cover. These rules, on the other hand, are very focused on the Middle Ages, which is nice to see. That's what got my attention about these rules. Very nice. Let's take a look at the rules itself. Now, they're written by Alan Campbell, kind of a labor of love of sorts by this gentleman. Rampant Lion Games, you can look that up, rampantLionGames.com. I'll put the link in the description in case you're interested. It's about 65 plus pages of army lists and rules and plenty of charts to play the game. And then you got this final sheet here is actually a blank sheet for notes. Nice little touch. But again, it's spiral bound, so it's going to lay flat on the table, as you can see, and you can also fold it over. So there you go. This is something that you can use during play quite efficiently. Like that. Black and white, although there are some color illustrations, as you can see, as well as photographs from the author's collection. There you go. And that's some photographs. But we'll take a look at the book itself in a minute. You also get two play sheets, one for 15mm scale miniatures and one for 28mm scale miniatures, whatever you collect. Double-sided, there you go. Plenty of information on these. You also get a dozen dice, 6 different colors. There's basically 2 of each color. Here's 6 of them right here. The values on each dice are reflective of the colors. 6 being the best. I think it's the only dice that actually has a 6 on it. And I don't believe there's any 1s on this either. So the dice you roll during the game, which is reflected up here on this little bar, your best dice are the red, and the lowest, the worst dice, no 6s on that. In fact, there's only 1s and 2s on that die, is the yellow. So this little bar is on both sides of the play sheet when you're playing. Very handy to have that. So yes, you do get these dice, and they're critical to the game. You do not use any other dice in this game. All you need is the dice that come with the rules. In addition, you also get these cards. These are used. I got plastic protectors on these sleeves. I think there's 8 of these, one for each command that you control in your army, which is 3, plus an optional unit commander. It calls commanders captains in this game. That's an optional commander. But normally an army is divided into 3 separate commands. And there you go. There's the van, there's the rear, and there's the main battle. That's the commander-in-chief's command. And finally, optionally, the unit commander. Basically, a commander that's attached permanently to a unit in the game. And of course, you get 4 red ones as well for the opponent. So each side will have one of those. These are shuffled at the very beginning of the game and drawn to see who goes first in each turn. And as each force is drawn, all units under that gentleman's command shall basically move and do his orders through the turn. Once he's complete, you move the card and you pull another card and do likewise for the next command. And that's how it flows throughout the game. When all have been pulled, you move on to the next phase in the turn, which is missile fire. So that's how these cards come into play, and you do get these, 8 of them, with the game as well. So there they are. So dice, rules, charts, and the cards. That's what you get for your price you pay. And the price is just under $40. I think it's $34 something to get the dice, cards, and rules all in one shot. So check it out. I believe it's rampantlion.com or Rampant Lion Games. I'll put the link to Mr. Campbell's rules in the description in the video. So now let's actually take a look at the rules themselves. First thing I probably should look at is the basing system and what defines a unit in this game. Now, DBX standard basing is pretty much suggested in the rules, although any basing that you use is usable with these rules. I mean, you can use anything from a single base to represent a unit, or, like suggested in the rules, 4 of them. 2 ranks. You got 4 bases, basically. And that, in 15 mil, would actually be an impetus size based. In other words, double width, double depth, which is 80 mil. In this case, 60 mil. So that's how you can represent your units in the game. This is the suggested mode, where you've got 4 bases and 2 ranks. It looks good on the table, and actually I prefer this in my test games. This is what I would prefer. But just as well, you could play a game like this, where that represents 1 unit, and maybe your infantry could look like this, with 2 units, 1 base frontage, or even that. And there are rules in here, by the way, for a quick version, which basically allows you to play like this, which essentially is like DBA. You're using half movement rates, half distances to shoot, single bases for every unit, and you're playing on a very small area, such as 2x2 or 3x2, very DBA feeling. So that's how the basing works, and all the rules for basing are in here, so you're not left out in the cold. Mr. Campbell has you covered. In addition, some other things you might find useful in your games would be some markers. In my test games, I used some yellow markers to represent disorder, units that are in disarray and are less effective and efficient in battle. I used those, so you might want to grab yourself some little chips as well. And of course, one of these little markers or something to measure your degrees. You know, when a unit shoots, it shoots within 45 degrees, or when it's carrying out wheels, and so on and so forth. So yeah, some little extra components you might want to add to your game, and that's all. That's all you will need to play this game. Nothing special about that. Now, let's actually get into the rules themselves and see what's in this bad boy. Let's check it out. Of course, you got a nice little table of contents. There's all the goodies that are in here. The author goes into some basic concepts, like all measurements are done in the rules, all the basic stuff, a little description of the dice and how they work in the game, a little basics. And here's a nice little ad. It shows you what numbers are found on the various colors of dice. Like the black one here has a 1, a 2, a 2, a 3, a 3, and a 4 on its 6 facings. So you can see right away what's the better dice. And as always, the higher the number, the better. Then it goes into describing the command cards. Roster sheets, which are always useful in any game, and I'll get to that later. The scale of the game, what basically units represent, and the basing requirements, which we covered. Little terminology section, sample, unit, statistics. Let's take a look at this. This is basically how your army lists are organized and what your roster sheets look like. You're going to have a unit type, such as feudal knights. You're going to be followed by a stat for fatigue, which is basically like hit points, how much damage it can take in a battle before it's reduced to 0 and removed from the battle. Followed by disorder dice. Very important, disorder dice. Disorder is used extensively in these rules to see if units fall out of rank and file and get scattered into disarray and thus less effective in a fight. For instance, the feudal knights will roll black. Melee dice, when they're involved in melee and fighting, this unit will use white dice. Shooting dice, if they have missile weapons, this unit doesn't, it'll be either not applicable or have a color of dice as well, such as these feudal crossbowmen. Next we have target dice. This is the dice they will roll, this unit will roll, when they're shot at by missile troops. And in the case of the knights, it's green. And finally, any special characteristics. These are very akin to, say, traits in Black Powder or Hail Caesar, something that makes the unit stand out as special. For instance, feudal knights, a very common trait, is impetuous. These guys might go out of control during the game before you have any chance of moving them on your own. They might rush towards an enemy which comes in view. basically upsetting your flow of orders. Not good. So this is the basic layout for the army list. It's basically the name of the unit, its fatigue number, and then the rest of the stats are basically all just dice that you roll. And that's about it, just the color of dice they roll for various mechanics in the game. Disorder, melee, shooting, and if they're shot at. And of course, finally, a special characteristic. Now the next page here actually goes into how you set up the game, everything you do from generating the terrain, the layout, deploying your troops, and so on. It also goes into how you create your armies, the stuff you do before you set up your game. It covers everything to get the game all set up. It goes into the terrain types, which is really simple actually. There's basically good ground, rough ground, and difficult ground. And of course there would be impassable as well. Obviously something you cannot cross whatsoever. Defines all those elements of terrain in the game. Goes into placing them. Then it goes into deploying the armies. There's an attacker. There is a defender in this game. And usually the defender lays out the terrain. The attacker has the option of moving some pieces. Very simple system for terrain generation and laying it out. I know a lot of rules are complicated in that area. But this is very simple and quick to set up a game in terms of deployment and laying out terrain, the choices of terrain you have. Very simple, very fast moving, no issues whatsoever. Next section, it goes into the actual turn sequence. Turns, let's take a look at this. Pull this card up because it is on the card as well right here. Basically it starts off with impetuous checks and movement. When it says end movement, it means if an impetuous unit fails its test, which is a disorder test. Remember, units are rated for disorder. If they fail it, they will move at this point. So the first thing you do is check all impetuous units to see if they go out of control. This is followed by the commander card phase and actual movement. This is where you draw a card, and everyone in that command that's in command distance, command radius of their commander, can now move. If a unit is not within the command radius of the general, they have to make a disorder test, there it is again, to see if they can move normally or fall into disorder if they attempt to move. Of course, they could sit there and do nothing if they're out of command, and then you don't risk them falling into disorder. But that's what happens during this phase, and this means that the turn is very interactive. It could be 2 blues and then a red and then a blue and then a red, so both players are moving and their units at the same time, basically, in order of the cards, actually. Once the last card is pulled, you go into missile shooting. It's all simultaneous. Basically, you decide where guys are shooting, if they're armed with shooting-capable weapons, and you resolve those by rolling various dice. In this case, shooters will use their shoot stat, which again is a color of dice, going against a target unit, their target stat. When they're targeted, they'll roll a certain dice. And both players roll off. Let's say red is the shooter. Whoever gets the highest, well, the shooter got 2, the target got 3. In this case, the shooting was totally ineffective. Let's say the green was the shooter and red was the target unit. In this case, you find the difference between the scores, 1, and the target will receive that many of hits. So in this case, 1 hit goes on the red targeted unit. So whatever their fatigue value is, it drops by 1. So there you go. And that might call for some disorder tests, usually if you take 2 hits. Again, disorder is very important in the game. So that's how shooting is done. Very simple. And that goes into melee combat. That's where units are touching. There is no charging in this game. Units just move into contact. There is no aligning either. So however they make contact, that's, you know, a melee. If a unit moves into front edge contact with an enemy unit, it's deemed a melee. And those will be resolved at this time. And both players, to start this phase off, will roll 2 red dice. And the one who rolls highest determines whether you work from the left of the table or from the right of the table. His choice. And you work on all the melees like that and resolve them one at a time. The rules do cover multi-unit melee as well, which can happen. Very interesting. And I should go back a little step here and mention that there is no group moving in these rules. That said, I don't believe it's actually necessary in this type of game. I know a lot of DBX games, and of course Impetus, they have rules for group moves, but this set of rules does not have that. But the thing is, it doesn't really need it, especially since melee is a separate phase and isn't resolved during a unit's movement. So it doesn't really need group movement. The rules work fine without them. There is no player initiative point, pip, expenditure. When a card is drawn, all of his stuff moves, so there's no worrying about group moves. You just move them. And if they're out of command, you roll dice to see if they move or go into disorder. Anyway, getting back to melee, once that is complete, we go to rallies. That's where units that are marked with a disorder marker, or otherwise indicated as disordered, get a chance to rally. Not all units will be able to do so, of course, during the game. If they're not within command radius of a commander, they can't rally, for instance. And I should point out that command radiuses are typically, normally, 12 inches for the commander-in-chief and 10 inches for any other commander in his army, any non-CNC, basically. And then it has mentioned down here of any disorder tests, crisis tests, which is another test, very interesting. It's where your army literally can fall apart for you. As units break and run, it can affect other units close by. They make a crisis test, and they could end up running as well, which can have a chain effect in the game, and your army could basically fall apart. And yes, folks, it has happened in both of my test games that I played. It is devastating. And then breakpoint checks for each army. That's how you win the game. The game does use breakpoints. After the sequence, it goes into the specifics of each phase of the turn, like your impetuous movement, command cards, drawing them, and then it goes into moving. There's wheeling, there is oblique movement, which is a fancy way of saying move in any direction with any facing. Not all units are capable of that. There's about facing, there's retrograde movement, which is moving backwards, facing the enemy, or facing your original direction, and so on. And it describes each unit and what types of those 4 movement types I described they are capable of, including heavy artillery, light cavalry, medium foot unformed, medium foot formed, and heavy foot, and so on. Now, these subcategories for medium foot, incidentally, are referring to basically missile-armed medium foot. You basically have medium foot, spears, swords, and whatever. Then you got those that are equipped with missile weapons that are also medium foot. They're termed MFU, or medium foot unformed. So there's stats for them regarding movement in here as well. Officers as well, of course. Units exert a zone of control, which is 3 inches to their front. As you'd expect, it restricts the movement of enemy units that are in that zone. That's what that's all about. Then it goes into shooting. Very quick, simple method. Again, I kind of covered that. There's arcs of shooting, so on and so forth. Basically, the shooter rolls his dice, and the target rolls his dice. You want to score higher for the shooter if you want to cause any damage. Otherwise, no effect. Interesting. Then it goes into melee. Now, this is the meat of the game. Here's the basic procedure that it covers, the 2 bullet points. Tells you how to make the dice rolls, the tests, the modifiers, and they're quite extensive here, as you can see. Now, I would have to point out that the melee system here is very reminiscent of games like DBX, that is, where you have follow-ups and recoiling and that sort of thing. This game has that. I mean, your battle lines, once they engage in melee, in other words, in contact, they don't just sit there until one is destroyed. There's going to be units that fall back. There's going to be units that fall up. Your battle line is basically going to break up quite quickly once melee contact begins. So I like that, and that's a high mark of these rules. So if you enjoy melee combat in your games, and who wouldn't if you're a fan of the Middle Ages or Ancients gaming in general, these rules really make it look like it would. So that's kudos to Mr. Campbell for putting this into the game. That said, I have to also say that it's not like DBX in that it goes into a little bit more detail. for instance, losses to enemy fatigue and stuff. And if a unit does follow up, you know, it might force a disorder test immediately on the unit that fell back. So all kinds of little interesting stuff regarding melee in this game. Very well done. And there's plenty of examples for handling multi-unit melees, flank attacks, how it is resolved, these examples here. So it's very clear regarding how to handle melee. And again, this is probably the most complex part of the rules, and it's worthy of this extended description presented here. Knight units, cavalry units, horse units can also bounce off heavy and medium foot. That's interesting. I like that. Knights could also cut through enemy units if they do enough damage on their initial contact with the enemy. And of course there's rules for officers leading a combat and being involved in a melee, giving bonuses and such. You can also risk getting killed, so it's kind of a risky thing. Kind of interesting. Officers can be captured as well as killed, which is kind of cool. For instance, if a commander is captured, the unit that he was fighting captures him, and if the unit that's fighting him manages to win a combat following that, they can rescue him, which is kind of cool. Otherwise, if contact is broken and his original unit does not win the combat, he's assumed to be either killed or taken off board, held for ransom, so on and so forth. Very simple rules mechanics for doing that. Nice little color, nice touch. I like it. There's rules for units supporting each other, which is good in disorder tests. Good to have. You know, your men are more likely to stand their ground if they know there's some equally equipped and trained troops behind them. Then it goes into disorder, which is an important part of the game. You're going to make a lot of these tests in the game. They are critical. Modifiers for the die roll, and so on and so forth. Basically, if you roll a 1 on whatever color dice you're rolling, you're disordered. You'd mark them like so to indicate disorder. It has penalties in melee, penalties for a lot of things, so it's not a good thing. You don't want your units being disordered. You can be disordered by moving through terrain. There's rules for failing a disordered test if you're already disordered. You basically don't accumulate disorder markers. Instead, if you're already disordered and you fail a disorder test, you take 2 casualties, 2 fatigue points instead. Very reminiscent of impetus, I believe. Then it goes into something really fun that I mentioned earlier, the crisis test, which is basically this is where your army could literally fall apart quickly. And I noticed in my games that as I played, units accumulated fatigue losses, but they still were fighting on. But eventually, you're going to get a lot of disorder. Eventually, one unit is going to break. And when that one unit breaks, other units close by could end up making crisis tests. And that could force them to also either be disordered or rout entirely from the battlefield, which can cause other units to make a crisis test. And it is brutal, but I'm telling you, this is really fun. A fun aspect to the game. I really like this. Very simple way to resolve it. There's only a few modifiers and very simple to resolve. Very fun part of the game. So there's your crisis test. And here he outlines everything that causes a crisis test, such as your camp being sacked, or the general being killed, the captain being killed, unit destroyed or routed, and so on and so forth. Then it goes into rallying. This is the last thing you do in a turn, is where units that are disordered can attempt to get rid of that disorder by making a rally test. Kind of like a disorder test, but it doesn't count as a disordered test. It is a rally test. So there you go. Covers that. Nice and simple. Goes into an explanation of fatigue for you right here in the later section of the rules. Permanent fatigue is where you're taken to 2 or less fatigue points. You're considered permanently fatigued. You basically can't engage the enemy. You can't move towards the enemy. You can still shoot. You can still fight in melee if you're attacked, but you cannot move toward the enemy or engage in melee on your own account if you are a unit that's permanently fatigued. Next section goes into army breakpoints. Now, the system you have a point system, and based on the point system, the points at the value of the game, it'll suggest for you the breakpoint of both armies. For instance, I played a 300-point game, and the suggestion for that would be 18 breakpoint value for each army. So there you go. Once you reduce to 0, your army is broken. And this is checked every time a unit is removed from play. So it could happen in the middle of a turn somewhere, you know, and suddenly, boom, the game's over. That's it. Battle is done. Very simple, straightforward. Here's the various breakpoint values that losing a certain unit type will cause. For instance, if you lose a knight unit, it reduces your breakpoint to 3. By 3, I should say. If you lose a light cavalry unit, your value goes down to by 2. So, you know, the value of troops in terms of your army breaking is going to be dependent on the unit type or exactly what happens. Like, for instance, camp sacked is going to reduce your breakpoint to 4. So, yeah. And finally, we got this fast play variant. That's what I was talking about before. This is where you get a very DBA-esque type of game. Fast moving in a small table, small units. So that's a little section right there for you to play games like that. Good way to get started with these rules. And the rest of the rules are basically scenarios, sample, point values for all the different unit types in the game and how they'd be rated so you can make your own armies. Lots of potential for this. All the unit types, their ratings, and their point cost. And here we have generic unit options. These are basically all the special abilities that I was mentioning earlier as well. For instance, Flower of Chivalry. French units have this. French knights have this. Basically, when they make contact with an enemy unit, that enemy unit immediately has to make a disorder test. Very nasty. That's a nice little trait to have. Frenzied Charge, Stalwart Foot, Ruthless Mercenaries, Religious Standard or Relic. These are all your traits that units can have in a game. Arrow Storm, pretty effective, very effective. My Welsh Longbowmen have this, and whenever they shoot, as long as they cause a hit, they force a disorder test on the enemy. In addition, they get another bonus in that more units can support shooting. I actually didn't cover that, did I? Units can shoot individually, one at a time against one opponent. Or if you've got 2 shooting units that can shoot at the same single enemy unit, what you could do, and it's particularly useful if you're not very good at shooting, they can combine and roll once instead of separately. And it's kind of a supported shot. It gives the main unit that's shooting a bonus. It ups their color by 1. Arrow Storm units can go up to 2 supported units, so their basic dice roll when they shoot will go up 2 colors. For instance, start off with blue, and I had 2 other units shooting at the enemy. Because of Arrow Storm, it would jump up 2. Bump, bump, I'd be using a green dice. Pretty nice. That's what Arrow Storm does. So this supporting for shooting is kind of like DBA, L'Art de la Guerre, where you got more than 1 unit shooting at the same target. It does cover that, but it's not mandatory. It's an option to do. You got the optional unit captain that we mentioned earlier as well. And again, there's point values for these various traits. So again, you can build your own armies, which is nice, especially considering that there's really only 9 army lists in this set of rules. Now, I'm sure Mr. Campbell will expand this. In fact, I know he is. He's working on War of the Roses armies, or 100 Years' War, I believe. But here you got the feudal English, feudal French, feudal Scots, which are my favorites. You got the Holy Roman Empire, early Crusaders, Syrians, early Teutonic, medieval Russian, and War of the Roses. There they are. They're already in there. Nice. So there you go. These are the lists in there. Here's what they look like. Let's grab one and take a quick look. Get a little zoom there so you can see. Unit types, point cost, and then we go into fatigue, and then disorder dice, melee dice, shooting dice, target dice if they're shot at, and any special ability. Now these are French. They do have mandatory Flower of Chivalry. In other words, they automatically come with that. Some of these traits are optional, so you don't have to have them, and if you do take them, you add that ability's point value to the cost given here under points cost. For instance, feudal knights in the French army are basically 30 points. Special ability, Flower of Chivalry is optional. So if I add that to them, or any one unit, I add the Flower of Chivalry point value to their base cost of 30. They're also impetuous, which is mandatory. The cost of impetuous is built into the point value. And there's all the unit types. Now, the only thing that is left out here that probably should be in here, help players new to the game or new to the period especially, is number of units, or a suggested number of units based on a point value game. There isn't anything like that. So this is basically up to you to determine how many of each type you want in your army, which is okay. Again, if you understand the period or you have access to other army lists, you can kind of get the gist of how many of each unit type should be in an army. Not a problem. But again, if you were a beginner and new to the era, it would be nice to see that. So that's one little quirk the rules have, is there's no suggested number of units. Good thing, bad thing, I don't know. But there again, that's the way the lists are laid out. And again, army list for everybody. Special rules for various armies are described, like the big pike blocks of the Scots. What else we got here? Combined units of bill and bow. Yes, units can have missile weapons and melee weapons in it if it historically had such. Rules for that are covered in here. That is nice. And here we have a scenario, sample scenario, Battle of Bovines, 1214. Whoops, I'm still focused here. Sorry about that. We didn't miss anything there. Sorry. So it's got that scenario, map layout, and a description of all the units that fought in that battle. And here is your roster sheet that you can print out, just fill into your heart's content. And that's the rules, my friends. That is Vows of Iron. Good look at the cards, the play sheets. That's what you're getting. So, what do I think about these rules? Well, I'll tell you right now, I had a lot of fun. They work for solo play. I could see large multiplayer games working out fantastic with this set of rules. I enjoyed it. If you're interested in this particular period of history, I would recommend these rules. They have some nice feel and flavor for melee combat in particular, as well as the morale and how armies just fall apart and how they're quickly disordered and battle lines just deteriorate quickly. This set of rules really represents that quite well. In that sense, it's highly recommended. If you like tournament play, if you're a typical DBX or L'Art de la Guerre style tournament competitive player, these rules might not be for you. They're not geared for that style of play. In fact, I think these rules are a labor of love. I think Mr. Campbell really enjoys this period so much that, you know, he made this set of rules and added the flavor and color of the period to the rules. And that seems to be the focus, not so much on a balanced game as in a game that has a lot of feel for the period. So yes, if you are interested in this era, I highly recommend them. Give them a try. They flow very well. After a few turns of play, I caught on to this game quite quickly, and I knew what I was doing. This color system is very nifty and fun. I really enjoyed that. It basically consolidates all the math of going +1, +3, +6, -2. And instead of dealing with those modifiers as numbers, you're dealing with colors. It's visual, very visual in that respect. So let's see, I'm green, I get a +1, so it's white. Then I get a -2 colors, so it drops the black, that kind of thing. It's really fun. It's not a dice-heavy game. Although right results can get kind of wacky. You could get a result of 6 against a 1 in this game, which is, you know, not unusual, but that is an extreme result. You can get that based on the colors. Not so likely when you've got two colors which are close to each other, like two reds or a red and white. Here we got a 2 going against a 6. I don't think there's any 1s on the white. No, so you'll never get the 1 versus 6 result in this case. It's very interesting, very fun. I enjoyed that. Simple, fast-moving, flowing system using this color to resolve all your tests. That said, melee is quite complex but not overwhelming. It takes some getting used to. There's a lot of fallbacks and pushbacks and disorder tests that go on during melee, but it's not overly complex. I mean, like I said, if you really enjoy melee combat in your games, this is a great set of rules, and you're going to enjoy the detail that is here in the melee system. But again, I don't want to sound like it's just overly complex, because it's not. It's a very simple, intuitive system. It just makes sense, and it's easy to get a hold of. Here's all the modifiers for melee, but you know, there does look like there's quite a few, but you're going to have a lot of combats where none of these apply, or maybe just one or two apply, tops. Not an issue. Here's all the modifiers for shooting, not a whole lot. There's all your disorder test modifiers. And here's the results of melee. In other words, the difference between scores is referred to on here. It gives you a result. So there it is in a nutshell, folks. I do recommend these rules if you're interested in this era of combat. It's one of the few sets of rules that is specific to an era. I do recommend them for that. If you're a tournament player, not much as recommended. They're not as tight in that regard. So yeah, there you go, folks. Well done, Alan Campbell. Again, check the description if you're interested in these rules. It's a very well written set of rules. Very good in my opinion. So check it out, folks. Vows of Iron. So we'll see you next time for my next video review. See what I got in the works. So take care, folks. I hope you enjoyed. Any questions or comments, leave them below. I'll be sure to get back to you. Take care, folks.